What's going on? Welcome back to the David F. Haas podcast. In this podcast, I talk about the political insanity that's happened over the last week. Justin Trudeau stepping down, Trump basically calling to take over Canada. I break down everything from what is a trade deficit to this $200 billion subsidy that Trump keeps talking about. And I talk about where I think we will actually land with all of this. So have a listen and let me know what you think in the comments of where we think we will land with this Canadian-American takeover. Is Canada going to become a part of the U.S.? Only time will tell. It's actually interesting. I couldn't not make a podcast about what's going on here with Trump and Trudeau stepping down. Big time in Canadian history and, actually the history of the world. And I think I just want to get into it. I did a little bit of research because, Trump likes to spew out a lot of information and like some of it's fact-based, some of it's kind of like just stuff that he's heard. And, while I am a supporter of Trump, this whole rhetoric of taking over Canada, it's interesting to me. And it seems a little bit bullyish, which I don't love. But I just thought I would make a podcast about this thing and break it all down to kind of get a feel for like what could actually happen here. And I think I know where it's going. I think what Trump's trying to do is he's trying to put out this wild idea of like Canada and US merging and becoming all part of the US. But it's going to lead more to like a Canadian-US union is I think where we'll end up where Canadians will get to keep their sovereignty. But that doesn't seem like what he's saying in his rhetoric. It sounds like he just really wants US to become the 51st state. And so just to get an idea where I stand as far as position, I'm open to the idea 100%. But in order for us to break this down, I think we have to understand that people have Canadian pride and all of this stuff. And like, will this really happen? So the first thing is that Trump keeps saying that Canada or US subsidizes Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year. And I was like, how is that possible? Like, how is the U.S. subsidizing Canada that much? And I think what he's referring to is the amount of protection militarily that the U.S. provides to Canada. Now, of course, this is in the best interest of the U.S. as well, because if illegal immigrants or Russian spies are coming into the waters of Canada or the airs of Canada, it's going to affect the U.S. It's kind of like what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I think that's what he's referring to, because as I looked into it, there were no subsidies that the U.S. was giving Canada. The other thing is he talks about the trade deficit. So what is the trade deficit? And essentially the trade deficit is the difference in the amount of trade that Canada trades to the U.S. versus what the U.S. trades to Canada. Now, obviously, there's a trade deficit because the United States is 10 times bigger than Canada. So, of course, we are trading more with the U.S. than they are with us. We just have less people. So that just makes sense. So the trade deficit thing is kind of out the window. The military thing, I kind of see his point on that he's protecting Canada and they're not getting anything out of it. So yeah, maybe there's something there. Does it cost $200 billion a year to protect Canada? I don't know. The other thing is that Justin Trudeau's government has basically brought all of this upon us. Basically, what the U.S. is seeing is that Canada is weak and Canada is vulnerable. And because of that, it may need saving. And, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, that he is worried that there has been so much damage done by the Liberal government that we may not be able to climb out of this thing. And that's what Trump's picking up on. He's picking up on the fact that Canada is so broken right now that the best option for Canadians would be to join America. It would make us more prosperous. It would lower our taxes. It would do all of these things, right? And so this is all a result of essentially weak men in power. And there's that saying that goes like, hard times create hard men create soft times create soft men, and then the cycle continues. And so that's what we're seeing as a result of this. And you're seeing the pendulum swinging back to more of the center, where we have strong male leaders, even strong female leaders. Men in general is not men, it's men and women. we have stronger leaders. And you see that in Pierre Poilievre. He's just more of a stronger leader. He speaks his truth, and he's not afraid to back down to Trump, to Trudeau, to anybody, to hopefully to policymakers and these types of things. So now we have stronger leadership hopefully coming into play, but is it too late is the question. Has Canada fallen too far? And as I kind of pondered that and I sat with this, I was like, I don't think so, because I think what the Conservative Party will probably do for Canada is we will open the floodgates to our natural resources. If the U.S. doesn't want to buy our oil anymore, then we'll sell it to the EU, right? If the U.S. doesn't want our natural gas, then we'll sell it to other countries. If they don't want our lumber, there's lots of people that want our resources. So I think Canada's in actually a pretty powerful position. If you look at countries like Qatar and Dubai, it's like those are super rich countries, and that's what Canada should be, because we have just as much, if not equal to, the reserves of resources that these countries do. So it's like, I think Canada could turn this whole thing around really quickly, and I think that we could do the exact same thing and say we don't need the U.S., and we could survive off of our own independence and our own resources. We have everything that we need here in the country. We could make that same argument, but I do think that it would be very, very beneficial for the Canadians to consider this. And what would the Canadians have to do in order to make the shift to be like, we're going to join with the U.S.? Well, one is you'd have to let go of your position of being a Canadian. And so I talk a lot about in spiritual growth of how we have to let go of positionalities, right? And so what does it mean to let go of a position? And so this is like a really advanced spiritual concept. It means we basically have no positions on anything. And every time I talk about this in my coaching or my groups that I was used to host, I would always get pushback. Like, how do you not have any positions? How do you not have opinions? And the reality is that when we hold on to positions, we get stuck defending those positions. So example, we're holding on to the position that we are Canadian. Well, what is being Canadian? Well, it's just it's just a country that was made up, taken over we took over the land from the Indians, all of these Europeans came over and we called it Canada. And now we are in the position that we are Canadian, right? And so if we are willing to step outside of that positionality and just look at the facts, then joining the U.S. looks really, really good. Like really good. Imagine being able to live as long as you wanted to the U.S. Imagine having access to the U.S. market. Imagine being able to cross the border without any hassles. Like it would just open up the world for Canada. But the Canadian leaders, including the Conservative Party, are like, no way, Canada will be Canada. And it's all about this positionality. And so I understand where the general consensus is, but just to kind of give you the ability to step out of that positionality just for a second, just to be like, well, if I wasn't holding on to this idea of being Canadian, would this be a good move? And if you can step out of that, then you might be able to see it from a different light. But I think the number one thing that would be preventing Canada from joining the U.S. is that positionality. So it's interesting to see that. A lot of Americans have believed that it's a manifest destiny, that eventually the U.S. and Canada will be one. And, I remember reading about that in like history in school when I was in grade school. And I was like, oh, that's wild that that never happened. But that intention of the U.S. to join Canada or to take over Canada, that's the way I was reading it back in the day, has always been there. And what you're seeing is another manifestation of what you hold in mind tends to manifest. It's like the U.S., the embodiment of the U.S. always believed that they would one day own Canada. And now, because of Canada's weakness and because we have this leader that's now in power that, is looking at everything and is basically saying, hey, the deal that we have with Canada is not a good one for us. And so because of that, he's saying like, maybe we should look at joining. And he's bringing into manifestation, into reality, that manifest destiny that we talked about, we learned about in school. So where does this leave us? Well, firstly, with Trudeau stepping down, this was like pretty much like the ultimate bitch move for Canada, and it's like, because we have this incoming president that let's use the word hostile towards Canada. He's looking at the trade deals. He's looking at the military protection. And he's basically saying, hey, this isn't a good deal for us. I think a lot of it is, Trump understanding the art of the deal. And so it's like you kind of like ask for something really huge and then you settle on something a little bit better. So he's asking to take over Canada and he'll settle on getting our oil for cheaper, something along those lines, or a pipeline, maybe something like that. Right. And so I understand that that's probably what's going on here. But with the Liberal government, with Trudeau stepping down, it's like you have this president who is hostile, let's call it, towards Canada. You have the Canadian economy in shambles, and you decide that the best thing to do would be to take a 90-day break. It's just like, it's not in the highest interest of Canada for our political leaders to take a 90-day break. Like I've been an entrepreneur since I was 16, and like there are no 90-day breaks when you run a company. And so Canada is essentially a company. And so it's like, how do you take a 90-day break when you have a hostile takeover knocking at your door? It's like, it's just the most wild thing to me. And it's just a reflection of the last, decade of Trudeau's government. It's like everything that he says is essentially a lie. And it's only out of the interest of his own political future. And it's not in the best interest of Canada. And so when you have a party like that, it's like, it's very easy to see how we could be vulnerable to a hostile takeover. And I don't think that Trump is going to do a hostile takeover. I think a lot of this is just rhetoric, and it's, again, like this art of the deal. But let's take a look at, like, would I be okay with joining the US? And for me, it's like, because I can step outside of that positionality of being Canadian. And now, even though I say that, I do feel this like little bit of like pride, Canadian pride, let's call it. But there's a reason why we say pride goeth before the fall. It's because when we have pride, let's use an example of like wealth. If we're so proud of ourselves for achieving a high level of wealth, if that wealth goes away, we fall all the way back down to shame. And that's why all Canadians, well, I shouldn't say all, a large majority of Canadians are very defensive when it comes to the idea of Canada joining the US, because they are worried that if that happens, we will fall back down to shame. It's like we'll be the dog with the tail between our legs saying we couldn't keep our country afloat and we had to have the US to come in and save us. And so that's why we're so defensive, right? So that's why we're pushing back so hard on this, because Trump is basically saying, look, I could pull the rug out from underneath you, and where are you guys going to be without us, right? And then that is hurting our ego as a country. And because of that, we're pushing back. So if we are able to observe all of that and say, okay, this is what was really going on, let's just look at what would happen for Canada to join the US. And like, for me, it's like, I would be all about that, because I can step out of my Canadian pride, even though I feel a little bit of a calling. I feel that defensiveness. I feel like, ooh, that wouldn't be good. Like, ooh, the history. I see all of that. But if I step beyond that, I'm like, holy shit, this would be amazing economically for us. Like, to join with the US dollar, to see a merger of our resources coming back and forth, to be able to travel through all of North America unrestricted, to be able to move to different areas, better climates, to be exposed to the market. Like even like if I look at me in the bar industry for the last 25 years when I was running a bar, it's like I always said, if my bar existed in the US, I would be like 10 times as rich because of the volume that I was doing. But like everything in Canada is so expensive. Like our product cost when we were running the bar was like 40%. And so it's like, if you make $1 million a year, 400,000 of that million is going to product. In the US, the product cost of that is like a tenth. And so it's like, I would instantly, if I was in the US, be making an additional $300,000 a year. And so it's like, okay, so these are the benefits that would come along from us joining. Now, does the US have its problems? Of course. They have gun issues, school shootings, all that. But then if you look at the Constitution, right? Their Constitution is 1,000,000 times better than the Canadian Constitution, or Charter of Rights, or whatever we're calling it. And so it's like that First Amendment on its own would be worth joining the US, right? And we've seen what has happened. Canada has been essentially a testing ground for the World Economic Forum to test out the World Economic Forum's vision of you'll own nothing and be happier. The Canada, Australia, these are the countries that they're testing out these concepts. And a move to the US would pull us right out of that, right? And so there's just more strength in being aligned with a country like the United States and with that constitution. Canada, you could see, even if you just look at COVID, right? It's like we had some of the most stringent lockdowns in the entire world, where the U.S., while they had lockdowns, mainly in the democratic states, and it's also, if you look at the death tolls, are also highest in the democratic states, right? Which is like interesting because they had more strict lockdowns, but higher death tolls. And so COVID was an example of where Canada is heading if we don't get a leader that is able to push back on all of these one world order kind of policies. And so would joining the U.S. benefit us? Yeah, just based on the First Amendment alone, right? And so you're even seeing Zuckerberg basically saying, hey, we are no longer being the truth police. And I think that's the greatest thing ever. Is there bad stuff on the internet? Of course there is. But let the people decide what's real and what's not. Why are we putting a few people in power to decide what's truthful and what's not? It's like, this has always been the duty of the individual, right? It's like buyer beware. It's like you have to make a decision for yourself, and using the community to decide whether something is true or false would be like the way to do it, right? And we're seeing the world swinging back to that First Amendment, and like that is what the U.S. has. We don't have that in Canada, right? And so just on that on itself, it's like I would join the U.S. in a second, right? And so this podcast will probably get a lot of pushback, I'm guessing, but I am fine staying Canadian. Let me just get that straight. I have that Canadian pride that I can choose to step out of. I'm fine staying Canadian, but I think it would be hugely beneficial for there to be some sort of merger or union, Can-American joint currency, removal of the border between the U.S. and Canada. I think there would be huge economic impacts for that, and I'm hoping that that's maybe where we land. I think Canadian people want to keep their sovereignty. It's like they want to remain Canadian. And it's because of that Canadian pride thing, right? It's like the refusal to step out of the positionality of being a Canadian. And I get it. I understand it. And it's like, it's really hard, even for me, who's done a lot of spiritual work, to step out of that positionality. So I understand where people are at. I understand why this is starting to get like a lot of pushback. But I think I also understand what Trump's doing. He's asking for the world, and he'll settle with, half the world essentially, right? Which will be like some sort of trade deal or some sort of economic union, is what I'm guessing. But sometimes when you hear him talk, you're like, maybe it does seem like he's coming to get Canada. But that's where I think we'll fall. I think it's an interesting time to be alive, and I also trust, this is the idea of surrender, right? I also trust that everything's going to be fine. Like, yeah, do we kind of feel like everything's up in the air and our government's on pause for 90 days? We don't know who the next leader is going to be. We don't know what Trump's going to do. Yeah, it's a little bit uncertain, but I have faith that we'll all be fine. And that's just a testament to the work that I've done. Is like just I only control what I can control, and this is something that's outside of my own control. And I just step back and watch it all unfold, and whatever happens, we're all going to be fine. Not just me. We're all going to be fine. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. It'll be interesting to watch the next few months, January 20th, unfold, and we'll see where this whole thing lands. But it sounds like we're heading to some sort of potential merger, which I think would be great. But I'd be interested to hear what you think. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Don't forget, every Sunday I'm releasing a podcast. You can hear it on all podcast players just by searching the David F. Haas podcast.